call uh, which we call parables. The Good Samaritan, the prodigal son, the lost sheep, the sower, these are all well-known stories which perhaps people have learnt from childhood. And even if people don't know the meaning or the context of these parables, they're still quite familiar with these stories. Jesus was a master of communication, possessing a wonderful ability to convey spiritual truths in ways which were imaginative, challenging, and understandable. He spoke with a style and authority that the people of his time were unfamiliar with. In Matthew chapter 7, verses 28 and 29, at the conclusion of the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew makes this comment. He says, "Now when Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were astounded at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority and not as their scribes." So the people listening to Jesus detected a difference between the manner in which Jesus taught and the teaching that they were familiar with from their own teachers, the scribes. And in John chapter 7 and verse 46, when the temple police who had been sent to arrest Jesus returned to the chief priests empty-handed, they were asked why they had not brought Jesus to them. And they replied, "Never has anyone spoken like this." So this was the impression that Jesus' teaching had upon the people of his day, and it continues to have that impression upon us today as well. The parables formed a significant part of Jesus' teaching, although it would be difficult to give an exact number of the parables that Jesus told and which are recorded in the scriptures for us. One suggestion is that there are perhaps around 55. It really depends on what you mean by the word parable. The frequency with which Jesus spoke in parables, though, is seen in Matthew chapter 13, verses 34 and 35, where at the conclusion of an account of several parables, Matthew says, "Jesus told the crowds all these things in parables. Without a parable, he told them nothing. This was to fulfill what had been spoken through the prophet. I will open my mouth to speak in parables. I will proclaim what has been hidden from the foundation of the world." Matthew sees Jesus teaching in parables as the fulfillment of a prophecy from Psalm 78 and verse 2. The psalmist says, "I will open my mouth in a parable. I will utter dark sayings as of old." So Matthew takes that Old Testament verse and applies it to the teaching of Jesus and the frequency with which Jesus taught in parables. In Mark's account of this, which is in Mark chapter 4, verses 33 and 34, we read, "With many such parables he spoke the word to them as they were able to hear it. He did not speak to them without a parable, but privately to his own disciples he explained everything." So since the parables form such a significant part of Jesus' teaching, it's important for us to study them and to try to understand them. And so in this series, this evening we'll be defining what we mean by a parable, what is a parable, and we'll look at some of the reasons why Jesus taught in parables, and also have a look at how we should understand the parables. And then in our later lessons, we'll be looking specifically at a number of the parables that Jesus taught. So what is a parable? You may have heard the parable defined as an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. And there may be some truth in that definition, but it's really not sufficient to cover everything that is meant by the word parable. Indeed, it's quite difficult to give a single definition that applies to all that we could call parables. Our English word parable comes from a Greek word, parabole, and it's found 49 times in the New Testament. 47 of those occurrences are found in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And the other two occurrences are in the letter to the Hebrews, Hebrews chapter 9 and verse 9, where it's translated as symbol, and it's being used there in reference to the tabernacle symbolizing something. And then the second time it's used in Hebrews is in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 19, where it's translated as figuratively speaking, and it's applied to Abraham offering his son Isaac and as a sacrifice. And the writer speaks of Abraham figuratively receiving his son back from the dead. So that the use of the word in Hebrews there perhaps suggests to us something about the difficulty we may have in identifying what is a parable. But the Greek word parabole is formed of two words. The first part of the word para is a preposition meaning beside or something alongside something else. So it's putting one thing alongside another. And this is where our word parallel comes from. You might think of parallel lines like the railway track in the picture on the slide there. They are parallel lines. They are alongside each other. And then the second part of the word is ballo, which means to throw. We have our word ball, a ball is something which is thrown. There was an ancient weapon called a ballista, which threw arrows or other objects. So that's the meaning of this word. Ballo means to throw. So we put the two together and we get the meaning of the word parable. W.E. Vine, in his Dictionary of Bible Words, defines the word parabole as this: literally denotes a placing beside, akin to paraballo, to throw, or lay beside, to compare. It signifies a placing of one thing beside another with a view to comparison. So you're putting two things side by side in order to compare them, like the two cars in the picture there. And then from the Zondervan Pictorial Encyclopedia of the Bible, F.F. Bruce defines the word as a comparison, literally setting alongside. A parable is a saying or story that seeks to drive home a point the speaker wishes to emphasize by illustrating it from a familiar situation of common life. So again, we see that idea there. So we see that the parable involves this idea of putting two things side by side in order to compare them, and with the purpose of drawing a lesson from that comparison. So the parable takes something that is familiar and common, and by comparison uses it to illustrate something that might be unfamiliar or something that might be difficult for us to understand. We shouldn't think that the parables began with Jesus. He wasn't the first to speak in parables, although his parables are probably the best type that there are. In the Old Testament, the Hebrew word that's equivalent to the Greek parabole is the word mashal. And in the Greek version of the Hebrew scriptures, mashal is frequently translated as parabole. The word mashal, the Hebrew word, is used in the Old Testament of a wide range of sayings and discourses, many of which we would not think of as being parables. It's used 39 times in the Old Testament, and depending on which version of the Bible you're reading, it may be translated as parable. We mentioned Psalm 78 verse 2 earlier. It's translated that way there, and Ezekiel chapter 24 verse 3 in the English Standard Version. It's translated as discourse in Numbers chapter 23 verse 7, which if you think back to our earlier lessons of Balaam's messages there were described in that way. It may also be translated as a proverb or proverbs, byword and taunt, also translated as allegory in a couple of references in Ezekiel there to that. So this word mashal we see covers a wide range of sayings or statements. It's not confined to the stories that we might think of as the parables. And in addition to these sayings defined by the word mashal, there are also several stories in the Old Testament that would match our definition of a parable, although they are not called parables in the text. They are stories that teach a point. Perhaps the best known would be from 2 Samuel chapter 12, verses 1 to 16, which is Nathan's story, which he told to David concerning the poor man's lamb that was taken by the rich man in order to feed an unexpected guest. Nathan the prophet came along and told David this story of this poor man having his one lamb being taken away from him by the rich man. And the story was told in order to convict David of his sin of adultery with Bathsheba and the murder of her husband Uriah. And David was quick to condemn the rich man who stole the lamb, but then not realizing the application that was being made to himself until Nathan said to him, "You are the man." There's another story recorded in 2 Samuel chapter 14, verses 4 to 7, which would fit our definition of a parable. This is a woman of Tekoa who comes along and tells David a story in order to try to encourage David to recall his son Absalom from his exile. And then in 1 Kings chapter 20, verses 39 to 43, there's a prophet story there, an unnamed prophet who tells a story to King Ahab in order to rebuke the king because he spared the life of Ben-Hadad, the king of Syria. So similar situations there, these stories being told in order to teach a point, to teach those who were listening. And then in Isaiah chapter 5, verses 1 to 7, we have the song of the Lord's vineyard, in which Israel is being compared to a vineyard, and it's the Lord's vineyard, and the details there speak of the vineyard being neglected and walls falling down, but it's teaching a point about the history of Israel. So we see these stories in the Old Testament, which sort of prefigure the parables that we have in the New Testament. When we consider the use of the word parable in relation to the teaching of Jesus, we find that it also covers a very broad range of meanings. It's used most frequently to refer to the stories that Jesus told to convey these important moral and spiritual truths. So Matthew chapter 13 and verse 3. Matthew chapter 13 is a chapter that contains quite a number of parables here, but it begins in chapter 13, verse 3. He told them many things in parables, saying, a sower went out to sow. So it introduces the story there of the sower. Luke chapter 15, verse 3 as well, another familiar one here. Luke chapter 15, verse 3. So he told them this parable, what man of you having 100 sheep, if he has lost one of them, does not leave the 99 in the wilderness and go after the one which is lost until he finds it? So again, it's being introduced as a parable. He told them this parable. But the word is also used of shorter sayings, proverbs, we might say, which were uttered by Jesus. It's translated as proverb in Luke chapter 4, verse 23, where Jesus says, doubtless you will quote to me this proverb, doctor or physician, cure yourself. We wouldn't think of that perhaps as being a parable, but it's, and the text translates the word as proverb, but it is our word parabole that's used there. And then in Matthew chapter 15 and verse 15, Peter asks Jesus to explain this parable to us, and he's referring to the saying made by Jesus in verse 11, where Jesus says it's not what goes into the mouth that defiles a person, but it's what comes out of the mouth that defiles. So another short saying, it's not one of these stories, but still it's called a parable. And then in Luke chapter 5, verse 36, we have Jesus' statement about tearing a piece of cloth from a new garment and putting it on an old garment. putting new wine into old wineskins. This is also called a parable. And we see it fits the definition because it's drawing this comparison. It's putting one thing alongside another to make that lesson and to draw that comparison. And then in Luke chapter 6 and verse 39, we have the short saying, can a blind person guide a blind person? Will they not both fall into a pit? And again, that's called a parable. The word parabole is also used of statements which are similes. A simile, we mentioned this in our study on the Psalms recently on Sunday morning. What a simile is. A simile is a statement in which one thing is said to be like or as another. So the comparison between the two things is being explicitly stated. And we can see a few examples of this again from Matthew chapter 13. Matthew 13 verses 31 and 32. It's called a parable. Another parable he put before them, saying, the kingdom of heaven is like a grain of mustard seed, which a man took and sowed in his field. It is the smallest of all seeds, but when it has grown, it is the greatest of shrubs and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and make their nests in it. It's called a parable. Uh, Verse 31 calls it a parable, but it's also a simile because it has the word like there. The kingdom of heaven is like a grain of mustard seed, which a man sowed in his field. And then in verse 33, he told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like leaven, which a woman took and hid in 3 measures of flour till it was all leavened. Verse 44, the kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field, which a man found and covered up. Then in his joy he goes and sells all that he has and buys that field. And verse 45, again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant in search of fine pearls, who on finding one pearl of great value went and sold all that he had and bought it. We will be looking in more detail at these parables in a later lesson as well. But we see that we would call these similes because of the use of that word like. The kingdom of heaven is like, but they're also parables as well. So these are not what we think of as complete stories, as we might think of parables, but a comparison is being made between one thing, the kingdom of heaven, in order to make a particular point. Now, we should say something about the Gospel of John, because John does not use the word parabole in his Gospel at all. And he does not record any of the story parables that we find in the first 3 Gospels, the Synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. However, John does use another word, the word paroimia, which means something said by the way. And he uses that word to describe some of the obscure language that Jesus used. So in John chapter 10 and verse 6, after Jesus had spoken about the sheep in the sheepfold, John adds, Jesus used this figure of speech with them, but they did not understand what he was saying to them. So would we call that a parable? Maybe it fits our definition, but John doesn't use the word. Here, the word paroimia is translated as figure of speech in more recent versions, but in the authorized version, the King James Version, it's translated as parable, but it's not the Greek word parabole. And then paroimia is also used again in John chapter 16, verse 25, and John 16, verse 29, and it's translated in those places as figures of speech, or the authorized version translates the word there as proverbs. So we can't be dogmatic about what is and what is not a parable. A long story or a short saying used to illustrate a point by making a comparison is really what a parable is. So how should we understand, or how should we interpret the parables? For a long time, the parables were interpreted as allegories, where every point or every detail of the story is given some spiritual meaning or significance. Now, this method of interpretation was known as the allegorical method, which tries to explain the hidden meaning within the story. However, there are only two of Jesus' parables that are interpreted in that way by Jesus himself. And these are the parable of the sower. Again, we're in Matthew 13. Matthew chapter 13, verses 1 to 9, records the parable itself with the man going out sowing the seed and it falling on the different types of ground or soil. And then Jesus explains it in Matthew chapter 13 from verse 18. He says, "Hear then the parable of the sower." And he goes through it. So when anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what is sown in his heart. This is what was sown along the path. And so he goes through the parable explaining what the different types of soil represent there. And then also the parable of the weeds in the field, later there in Matthew 13, verse 24 to 30. He tells the parable. The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man who sowed good seed in his field while men were sleeping. His enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat. So he tells the story, and then he explains it. Verse 36. Then he left the crowds and went into the house, and his disciples came to him, saying, "Explain to us the parable of the weeds of the field." And he answered, "He who sows the good seed is the Son of Man, the field is the world, and the good seed means the sons of the kingdom, the weeds are the sons of the evil." So again, Jesus looks at each of the points in that parable and he tells them what they mean. So perhaps these are the only two parables that Jesus explains in that way. Often the parables are just told and then they're just left for people to think about them for themselves. So perhaps Jesus' interpretation of these two parables led to the assumption that all parables were to be interpreted in this way as allegories. And an extreme example of this method of interpretation comes from Augustine's interpretation of the parable of the Good Samaritan. Augustine lived around the middle of the 4th century AD into the 5th century AD. And the Jesus parable of the Good Samaritan is from Luke chapter 10, verses 29 to 37. Augustine went through it and he explained what he thought each person and item represented. So the man traveling down from Jerusalem to Jericho he said, was Adam. The robbers who attacked him represented the devil and his angels. The priest who passed by was the priesthood of the old law. The Levite represented the prophets. The Good Samaritan was Christ. The oil which the Good Samaritan poured on the man's injuries was the comfort of good hope. The wine that he gave him was the exhortation to work. The beast or the donkey on which the man was placed was the human body of Christ. The inn where the man was taken to is the church. The innkeeper is the Apostle Paul. And the next day is the resurrection of Christ. These are just some of the things. I mean, he adds more details than the ones I've just mentioned there as well. So this is an extreme example of this method of interpretation. And you can really just make up anything you want, really, if you do it that way. So whilst not everyone agreed with this method of interpretation and warned against pressing the details of a parable too far, it was the predominant method of interpretation, not only of the parables, but really of the whole Bible, that hidden messages and hidden meanings in the stories of the Bible had to be figured out. So the Bible was treated as this puzzle book, which you had to decode it, work out the code to understand it. This allegorical method of interpretation continued until the late 19th century, when Bible scholars then began to question and to reject the allegorical method. And they argued that the parables were not these complex theological allegories, but rather they were more simple than that. They were designed to teach often a single main point, a simple moral truth. So, in the case of the parable of the Good Samaritan, this would be to show what it means to be a good neighbor. And Jesus had told the parable in response to the question that was asked, who is my neighbor? Who am I to love as my neighbor? And Jesus told the parable. So, looking for all of those details that Augustine found in this is going a bit too far. So when we're studying the parables, we should not look for significance in every little detail. Oh, what does this mean? Or what does this represent? But rather we should seek to identify the main point, or perhaps the main points that are being taught in the parable. So what is important, what's significant, and what is in there just to make the story flow. So the innkeeper, not the Apostle Paul, the innkeeper's just a character there in order to have the story make some sense. The inn isn't the church; it's just the place where the man is being taken to again, so that the story flows. We also need to look at the context in which Jesus spoke each parable. So we need to ask questions like, where was Jesus when he spoke this? Who was he speaking to? Was he speaking to a great crowd of people? Was he just speaking to his disciples? Was he speaking to his enemies? Is it being told in answer to a question that someone has asked, as with the Good Samaritan? And at what point in his ministry does he tell this story? Is this one of the parables he teaches during his last week there in the temple? We should also seek to understand the first century Palestinian background in which Jesus lived and taught. Jesus lived 2,000 years ago in a place very different to where we live today, in a time that's very different. So this requires some knowledge of the social and religious culture and customs of the time. So a knowledge of wedding customs of the time will help us to understand his parable of the 5 wise and the 5 foolish virgins. An understanding of hospitality, or how a meal was served, how people ate, will help us in understanding some of the other parables as well. An understanding of the geography from Jerusalem to Jericho helps our understanding of the Good Samaritan. Everyday events in Jesus' time are not everyday events for us in our time. We live in a different time. So if Jesus was with us today, he would be using the things around us, things that we see in our everyday lives. We should also see the parables in the context of Jesus' other teaching. So is our understanding of the parable, is it in harmony with what we know Jesus taught on other occasions as well? So why did Jesus speak in parables? We know perhaps for ourselves how using figurative language or illustrations and comparisons can help to clarify what we intend to say. That perhaps if someone doesn't understand what we're saying, we might use an illustration. Well, it's like this. And then we tell them a little story or make up some illustration to help them. So Jesus' use of figures of speech in his teaching then serves that same purpose. It makes things interesting and memorable, and it's easier to understand. That doesn't mean that the lessons of the parables were always clear or obvious to the hearers. As we've seen, the disciples sometimes went to him and asked him to explain what he meant in the parable. It wasn't obvious, the lesson. After Jesus had spoken the parable of the sower in Matthew chapter 13, his disciples came to him and they asked him in Matthew 13 verse 10, "Why do you speak to them in parables?" And in his answer, Jesus indicates 2 reasons why he spoke in parables. He spoke in parables to reveal truth to those who were willing to hear and to receive his word. So verse 11, he says to the disciples, "To you it has been given to know the secrets of the kingdom of heaven." But he also spoke in parables to conceal truth from those who were unwilling to receive it or to obey it. He goes on in verse 13 to say, "The reason I speak to them in parables is that seeing they do not perceive, and hearing they do not listen, nor do they understand." And Jesus then quotes from Isaiah chapter 6, verses 9 and 10, and he applies it to the people of his day who were unwilling to receive and to understand the word that he had brought them. So the parables served this dual purpose of revealing truth to those who were sincerely seeking it, wanting to find it, but also hiding it, concealing it from those who were unwilling to receive it or who might abuse it in some way. We can also identify some other reasons why Jesus spoke in parables. He spoke in parables to reveal to his enemies and his opponents their true relationship to God. So in Matthew chapter 21 and verse 45, this is in the last week of Jesus' life when he's been teaching in the temple, and he's been in conflict with some of the religious authorities here. He has just in the earlier part of the passage told them the parable of the wicked tenants. In verse 33, he introduces it here, another parable. There was a householder who planted a vineyard and set a hedge around it and dug a winepress in it. And he goes on to speak of the wicked tenants who end up killing the owner's son. And then in verse 45, he's telling it to the religious leaders, the chief priests and the Pharisees. So verse 45 says, "When the chief priests and the Pharisees heard his parables, they perceived that he was speaking about them." So he was revealing to them what they were like, their own character, what their relationship to God was like. So he's using the parable to do it that way. Also in Luke chapter 18 and verse 9, he also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and despised others. So we see the purpose of him delivering this parable here. Two men went up into the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. So it's the introduction to that parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. But Jesus is telling this parable to those who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and despised others. And that would apply to the Pharisees again there. So revealing to them what they were really like. He also used parables to cause people to acknowledge truth before realizing that it applied to them. And again, we can see that from Matthew chapter 21 and that parable of the wicked tenants there, that at the end of it, the religious authorities realize that Jesus is talking about them. He's saying these things about them. And that was the purpose of Nathan's story to King David about the rich man taking the poor man's lamb, that he told that story. Didn't say anything about, put in the story anything about David. It's only when David reacts to the story and condemns the rich man that Nathan then says to him, "You are the man." So David had acknowledged the truth told in the story before realizing that actually it's talking about him and what he had done. Another reason we could add here is that Jesus told the parables in order to preserve the truth that is taught in the parable. So we remember the story, and when we remember the story, we remember the truth that it is teaching us. So the story of the Good Samaritan, a very familiar story, we recall that story We think about the story, and then when we remember the story, we remember the truth that it is teaching us about how we are to be uh, a loving neighbor, how we are to treat our neighbors. So we remember the truth because we remember the story. Some of the features then of parables of Jesus, Jesus' parables show him to be an effective storyteller, um, and with the ability to gain the attention of the people. Often the major impact comes at the end of the parable with an element of surprise or with a sting in the tail. So again, to use the parable of the Good Samaritan, the surprising element in that is that it's the Samaritan who is the hero of the story. And again, you have to understand the background to that and of the hatred that existed between Jews and Samaritans. And yet Jesus makes the Samaritan the one who is showing mercy to his neighbor. So these stories are effective because they contain that surprise element, and sometimes they can be hard hitting in that way. The parables were spoken spontaneously, so the situation that Jesus found himself in produced the parable. Sometimes it was in response to an answer to a question that someone has asked, or a comment that someone has made, and Jesus tells the parable. So they are spontaneous. They're not speeches that Jesus prepared beforehand, but they arise from the situation that Jesus is in. And then the parables were told in order to produce a response or a change in attitude or behavior from those who heard them. They're not told in order to entertain people or to amuse people. Jesus isn't some sort of after dinner speaker, but rather they are to cause people, including us today, to read them and to think deeply about what they mean, to think deeply about God and about our own lives and what lesson is being taught us through the parables. In his parables, Jesus used material from nature and events from everyday life in order to teach about the kingdom of God and to show what life in the kingdom of God is about. So he speaks of seeds, he speaks of harvests, he speaks of vineyards, he speaks of sheep, he speaks of weddings, he speaks of people having meals in their homes, he speaks of people working, he speaks of servants and masters. He uses recognizable characters, shepherds, farmers, judges, widows, thieves, characters that people would have been familiar with at that time. So all of these things are important, and they're used by Jesus in his parables. They're everyday situations involving recognizable characters. But because we live 2,000 years away from the time of Jesus, it requires us to do a bit more study and reading to understand, well, what was the work of a shepherd in Palestine in the time of Jesus? How did people grow vineyards at that time? How were weddings conducted at that time? So that's where the material, the sources of Jesus' parables come from, those everyday events and circumstances. So in conclusion then, Jesus' use of parables proved to be a most effective method of communicating and teaching spiritual truth to the people. His words were challenging and not always easily understood or popular, but they always demanded a response from his hearers, that Jesus expected people to apply the lessons to their own lives. And so we want to study the parables as well. We want to understand what they meant to those who originally heard them, and perhaps more importantly, what they mean for us today. What lessons can we learn from the parables that Jesus taught? And again, this will require us to do some serious thinking and some serious reflection upon some of these things. So next week we'll begin with the parable of the sower of Matthew chapter 13, also recorded by Mark and by Luke as well. So if you want to get ahead and get ready for next week's lesson, those are the chapters that we will be having a look at. So we will stop